Constance Francesca Gabor Hilton was born on March 10, 1947, the only child of Conrad Nicholson Hilton and Zsa Zsa Gabor. 67 years later, she collapsed on the floor of a Los Angeles diner while her half-siblings controlled a global hotel empire, and her nieces moved through a world where marrying into the Rothschild banking dynasty qualified as a routine family event. Between those two dates, contested paternity, a will engineered to humiliate, failed lawsuits against a fortune too large to fight, a motel room she shared with people she feared, and a car where she slept. The Hilton dynasty didn't just neglect Francesca. They constructed her erasure so thoroughly that when her body gave out, the family whose fortune was built on providing shelter couldn't be moved to handle her remains. Conrad Hilton started with a single hotel purchase in Cisco, Texas, and built something that reshaped American hospitality from the ground up. The Dallas Hilton alone made him a fixture in the circles of post-war wealth and power, and invitations to join the social elite flooded in as his properties multiplied across the American Southwest and beyond. By the 21st century, the brand operated more than 6,000 properties across over 100 countries. You've passed the name 1,000 times, in airports, on highway overpasses, at resort corridors spanning 6 continents. In nearly every major city on Earth, Hilton means shelter, comfort, a clean room with a locked door. Francesca carried that name from the day she was born to the day she collapsed on a restaurant floor, and the name gave her nothing. The giving of nothing began before she drew her first breath. Conrad married Zsa Zsa Gabor in 1942, a union that fused one of America's wealthiest men with one of Hollywood's most luminous personalities. The marriage was a collision. Conrad's controlling behavior and deep religious conservatism grinding daily against Zsa Zsa's flamboyant independence, producing a relationship that multiple sources describe as combustible on both sides. By the time Francesca arrived in 1947, the marriage was disintegrating. What Conrad did next determined the trajectory of his daughter's entire existence. He publicly alleged that Zsa Zsa had been unfaithful, and he denied that Francesca was his biological child. He maintained that denial until the day he died. A deliberate, sustained repudiation, whispered in drawing rooms, repeated across decades, and eventually formalized in legal documents that would determine who received hundreds of millions of dollars and who received crumbs. From her first breath, Francesca occupied a specific and permanent position within the Hilton architecture, the daughter whose father said she wasn't his. Conrad's other children inhabited a different universe entirely. His sons from his first marriage to Mary Adelaide Barron, Conrad Hilton Jr., William Barron Hilton, and Eric Michael Hilton were embraced, included, groomed to inherit. Born of the right marriage, carrying the right credentials, positioned within the inner circle of power and corporate inheritance that Conrad spent decades constructing. Barron eventually became steward of the entire hotel empire, controlling assets measured in billions. Eric was embedded within the inner circle of the organization his father had built. All three could walk into any Hilton property on Earth and be recognized as belonging. All three inherited the full financial and social infrastructure their father built. They were provided for through family holdings and trust structures and, most critically, received the family's acknowledgement that they were Hiltons in every sense the word carried. Francesca inherited a surname and a rejection. She grew up suspended between two realities, physically proximate to wealth so vast it shaped skylines, yet denied access to the mechanisms that distributed it. Zsa Zsa's world was glamorous but structurally unstable. 9 marriages over the course of her life, an ever-shifting cast of stepfathers and households, no permanent financial architecture beneath any of it. The Gabor household was a revolving door of husbands, relocations, and the particular chaos that surrounds a woman more focused on her own celebrity than on building a foundation her daughter could stand on. Audiences who later studied Francesca's trajectory rendered a harsh but grounded verdict on Zsa Zsa. She failed in her most fundamental job as a parent, leaving her daughter without the connections or financial security that might have prevented what came next. But Zsa Zsa's failure, real as it was, operated on a smaller scale than the Hilton machinery arrayed against her daughter. The Hilton surname opened no doors that mattered for Francesca. In the family's hierarchy of belonging, no room had been built for her. Conrad made certain of that while alive, and his will ensured it survived his death. January 3, 1979. Conrad Nicholson Hilton died, and his last will and testament disposed of an estate valued at $200 million. The structure of that will reveals a man who had thought carefully about legacy, charity, power, and about which of his children deserved what fraction of his life's work. The bulk of the fortune went to the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, a charitable entity which would eventually grow to manage assets worth billions. His sons were provided for through existing family holdings and trust structures, arrangements carefully designed to ensure their continued wealth and involvement in the empire across future generations. The foundation and the family trusts were the machinery of wealth preservation that Conrad had spent a lifetime assembling, designed to endure and to resist challenge. Francesca received exactly $100,000. 100,000 out of 200 million, 1/20th of 1%. A fraction so precisely calibrated it read less as a bequest than as a message. Here is the exact dollar amount of your insignificance to me. The paternity denial that had shadowed Francesca since 1947 was now encoded into the final legal instrument of Conrad's life, translated from private cruelty into binding arithmetic. He could have left her nothing, which might have been cleaner, a pure erasure without the pretense of inclusion. Instead, he left just enough to acknowledge her existence, while quantifying exactly how little that existence meant to him. $100,000 in the context of a $200 million estate flowing into a foundation that would grow into the billions was designed to sting. Francesca challenged the will. She contested the will, challenging both the amount and the broader structure of the estate distribution. What Francesca's side didn't have was the resources to outlast the opposition. The Hilton Foundation's legal team, the estate's executors, the machinery of wealth preservation that Conrad had spent a lifetime assembling. All of it mobilized against one woman, asking her dead father to acknowledge her worth posthumously. Estate litigation of this kind doesn't turn on justice. It turns on endurance. And endurance is purchased by the hour at rates Francesca couldn't sustain. The court upheld the will. Francesca's challenge failed. Her claim to the Hilton fortune was extinguished with finality, and the door Conrad designed to exclude her locked for good. $100,000 in 1979 was real money, equivalent to roughly $350,000 in today's purchasing power, enough to buy a house in much of the country or, invested conservatively, to produce modest income for decades. A small but vocal group of people who've examined Francesca's trajectory argue she mismanaged the inheritance, that she failed to plan, that personal accountability has to enter the equation somewhere. Their argument deserves weight. Francesca's financial decisions after 1979 didn't produce long-term stability. Whether the fault lay in poor judgment, predatory advice, the savage cost of living in Los Angeles, or the psychological damage inflicted by decades of paternal rejection, reasonable people can weigh those factors differently. Some will look at that 100,000 and see a squandered opportunity. Others will look at the same figure and see an amount designed to fail a woman who had no family network, no business connections, no trust fund generating passive income, and no safety net of any kind in one of the most expensive cities in the Western Hemisphere. What reasonable people can't dispute is what happened when the money was gone. Across 3 decades of increasingly visible decline, the family whose name graced 6,000 properties worldwide did nothing for Francesca. No phone call, no check, no guest room in any of the thousands of rooms they controlled across 100 countries. When she was sleeping in her car, when she'd had a stroke and couldn't feed herself, the family that owned every Hilton on earth could have made one phone call. The inheritance might have been Francesca's to manage or mismanage. The 30 years of silence that followed belonged entirely to the Hiltons. Francesca spent those decades fighting to build something sustainable outside the family's orbit. She pursued acting, taking roles where she could find them, showing up for auditions in a city that runs on connections she didn't have. She worked in photography, selling her work where buyers existed. The grinding, relentless self-promotion that Los Angeles demands of anyone without a trust fund or an industry sponsor willing to return calls was her daily reality for years. Auditions, photo shoots, the constant hustle of a woman surviving in a city that worships youth and discards everyone else on a schedule. Her career efforts generated scattered recognition, enough to confirm effort and real ability, nowhere near enough to produce the income that could substitute for dynastic wealth or even cover the spiraling cost of rent in Greater Los Angeles. She showed up every time, and Hollywood didn't reciprocate on a scale that mattered. Each year, the gap between what she earned and what she needed to survive widened. And each year, the family that could have bridged that gap chose, with what appears to be unanimous consistency, to let her fall. While she fell, the Hilton fortune compounded in directions that make the contrast grotesque. Barron took the reins after Conrad's death and expanded the hotel chain into a truly global operation, planting flags on every continent with a major airport. The empire metastasized across borders and time zones. When Barron eventually sold a controlling interest to the Blackstone Group, the transaction was valued in the billions. Even after the sale, the family retained enormous wealth through the proceeds and through the continued growth of the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, whose assets compounded year after year, all flowing from the fortune that had allotted Francesca her 1/20th of 1% and sealed the vault shut. Barron's son Rick married Kathy Avanzino, who became Kathy Hilton, and together they raised daughters in a world of extreme affluence. Paris Whitney Hilton and Nikolai Olivia Hilton grew up in mansions, attended the right schools, moved through social circles where last names functioned as currency. Paris built a personal brand empire valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars, becoming one of the most visible figures in global celebrity culture, her lifestyle a permanent broadcast of luxury reaching millions daily. Then, in July 2015, 6 months after Francesca's death, Nikki married James Rothschild at Kensington Palace Gardens in London. James belongs to the Rothschild banking dynasty, one of the oldest and most significant in Western history. 2 separate commentators who examined the Hilton family timeline independently flagged this detail as a devastating omission from other accounts, and they were right to do so. One granddaughter of Conrad Hilton was merging into a stratum of wealth that dwarfed even the hotel empire through a palace wedding. Conrad's own daughter, one generation closer to the source of all that money, had been dead for 6 months, having spent her final year choosing between a dangerous motel room and her car. The Hilton family was wealthy enough to merge dynasties with the Rothschilds. Francesca had been too poor to rent an apartment. The erasure extended far beyond finances into the architecture of daily family life. Across the public record, Interviews, press coverage, society pages spanning decades, there is no evidence that Barron Hilton, Rick Hilton, Kathy Hilton, Paris Hilton, or Nikki Hilton made any sustained effort to include Francesca in family gatherings, to offer housing assistance, or even to maintain regular contact. She was socially excommunicated, a ghost carrying the most recognizable name in global hospitality. Withholding help from an aging relative sleeping in her car requires daily, deliberate renewal. Every holiday that passed without an invitation was a decision someone made. Every news cycle that carried word of her circumstances was an opportunity someone chose to ignore. Rick, Kathy, Paris, Nikki. Names attached to mansions, fashion empires, and real estate portfolios spanning continents. Any of them could have changed Francesca's circumstances entirely, with an expenditure that wouldn't have appeared as a line item on a quarterly statement. Nobody picked up a phone across 30 years. Zsa Zsa Gabor compounded the abandonment from the other side of the family tree. Still alive during Francesca's worst years, she established an estate plan that left everything to her ninth husband, Frederick Prinz von Anhalt. Von Anhalt's very title was reportedly purchased rather than inherited. He arrived in Zsa Zsa's life as husband number 9 and positioned himself as the sole beneficiary of everything she owned. Francesca was eliminated from Zsa Zsa's will entirely, cut out with the totality that made Conrad's insulting 100,000 look almost generous by comparison. The woman who had brought Francesca into the world, who had carried her and named her, looked at her estate plan and decided her daughter merited precisely nothing, while a man with a purchased title received everything. Notarized paperwork orphaned Francesca long before either parent actually died, abandoned through legal instruments rather than through accident of fate. Both the Hilton side and the Gabor side had closed their doors with bolts forged from probate law and witnessed signatures. By 2014, the year before her death, the descent had reached a point that would trigger crisis intervention from any social services agency in Los Angeles County. Multiple accounts place Francesca splitting time between a low-rent motel and her vehicle. The motel bore no resemblance to anything her father had ever built. A place where danger was ambient, where the locks felt inadequate, where violence among residents was a feature of the environment rather than an aberration. She reportedly described her surroundings with bitter, dark humor. "I live with murderers." 67 years old, biological daughter of one of the wealthiest Americans of the 20th century. Surname literally synonymous with hotels. Afraid of her neighbors in a place where the walls were thin and the doors didn't hold. The car, in some grim calculus, was safer. Francesca Hilton, heiress to nothing, daughter of everyone and no one, slept in her car in Los Angeles, within driving distance of buildings that bore her father's name. One unverified account regarding Conrad's character has circulated that extends beyond the documented cruelty of his will and paternity denial. A single anonymous individual, claiming to have met Conrad's personal secretary in a nursing home, alleged connections between Conrad Hilton and organized crime. No independent corroboration exists for this claim. No journalist, researcher, or legal proceeding has substantiated it, and it can't be presented as established fact. But the intense audience interest it generated speaks to something verifiable. The official Hilton narrative, entrepreneurial triumph, philanthropic generosity, family values projected across a global brand, has always depended on keeping certain people and certain facts invisible. Conrad's documented treatment of Francesca, preserved in his own will and public statements, already demonstrates a man who viewed his daughter as an inconvenience to be minimized with legal instruments. Whatever else Conrad may or may not have been, the record of what he did to Francesca requires no additional allegations to be damning. The family he raised continued that treatment for 36 years after his death, without needing any instruction beyond the example he'd set. On January 4th, 2015, Francesca walked into a Norm's restaurant in Los Angeles. Norm's is a diner chain. Vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting, laminated menus, coffee that never stops. She was 67. She'd spent the preceding months between a motel she feared and her car. She collapsed. An apparent stroke or cardiac event dropped her to the floor, surrounded by the clink of cheap silverware and the murmur of strangers who had no idea whose daughter was dying in front of them. The person who dropped beside her and began CPR was her fiancé, a man whose name appeared on no buildings anywhere in the world, whose accounts held no dynasty wealth, whose resources didn't include a hotel on any continent, a foundation managing billions, a fashion empire, or a connection to European banking royalty. His only credential was that he loved Francesca Hilton, and he was physically present when it mattered. He pressed his palms against her chest on the linoleum while paramedics were called, and other diners froze in the particular helplessness of watching a stranger's body fail. He was there. The family with 6,000 properties across 100 countries wasn't. Francesca was transported to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and pronounced dead on January 5, 2015. Her father had built an empire of more than 6,000 properties. Her half-brother Barron had expanded it across 100 countries and sold a stake valued in the billions. Her niece Paris had built a brand worth hundreds of millions. Her niece Nikki would marry into the Rothschild dynasty at a London palace 6 months later. Rick and Kathy Hilton presided over wealth on a scale most families can't conceptualize. Francesca died after collapsing in a diner, having spent her final year among people she feared and in her car. One allegation that has circulated, attributed to an individual who studied the family's response, not independently confirmed through financial records or official family statements, claims that not a single member of the Hilton family paid to have Francesca's remains cremated. Rick Hilton, Kathy Hilton, Paris Hilton, Nikki Hilton. Names attached to mansions, fashion lines, fragrance empires, real estate portfolios, and, as of 6 months after Francesca's death, a merger with one of Europe's oldest banking dynasties. While a blood relative did ultimately come forward to claim her, the available evidence shows no indication that any member of the Hilton family initiated care for her remains or contributed to funeral costs. The family, whose entire global brand was built on hospitality, extended none to their own dead. No family-organized memorial materialized. No public statement of grief emerged from the Hilton side. In death, exactly as in life, Francesca was made to disappear. The Hilton family's combined wealth at the time of Francesca's death, between the foundation's billions in assets, the Blackstone sale proceeds, Rick and Kathy's holdings, Paris's brand empire, and the income streams flowing from 6,000 properties in over 100 countries, exceeded any reasonable estimate by orders of magnitude. The cost of cremating Francesca wouldn't have registered as a rounding error on anyone's monthly statement. Spending that amount on the woman who shared Conrad Hilton's blood required nothing except the willingness to acknowledge she had existed. That willingness didn't materialize. A blood relative came forward to claim Francesca, but by all available evidence, no member of the Hilton family initiated care or covered the costs. The family, whose business was providing comfort to millions of strangers per year, regarded their own blood relative as beneath the smallest gesture of human acknowledgement. The Hilton name appears on buildings in over 100 countries, on highways and at airports, in cities you visited and cities you haven't. Every sign carries an implicit promise: shelter, safety, a door that locks, a room where someone treats you as though you matter. Francesca Hilton, Conrad's daughter, Barron's half-sister, Rick's aunt, Paris and Nikki's blood relative, got $100,000 engineered to insult, a courthouse that sided with the fortune, a will from her mother that gave everything to a man with a purchased title, a motel room she feared, a car to sleep in, a diner floor to collapse on, and a hospital bed to die in. The one person who tried to save her life owned no hotels at all. You'll see the name differently now. Subscribe for more stories like this.